Well, good afternoon, everyone. I think we'll get started. So I've had the privilege of presenting many abstracts and didactic presentations over the years at the SAEM meetings. In fact, I've attended every SAEM meeting since 1986. It wasn't called SAEM then, it was UAEM. So that's 37 years in a row. But I've never presented anything quite like this, what I'll present today, framed as a question: has it ever been this bad? I think the answer to that question requires some perspective setting, and as a historian of U.S. emergency medicine, I can provide information and a narrative and some messages from the people who founded the field. And then you can decide if it's ever been this bad. My hope, though, in presenting this is that we would not have a negative soul-searching experience, but a positive one, and see what our history can teach us about confronting our current challenges. So my only disclosure is that I'm the author of Anyone, Anything, Anytime, A History of Emergency Medicine, first published in 2006, and then second edition published in 2018. I receive royalty payments from the sales of this book, not many, no other disclosures. You can help that, though. So the first edition of the book was the result of a labor of love over 3 years as I traveled North America from LA to Nova Scotia and from Seattle to Southern Florida, doing oral history interviews with many of the founders of emergency medicine. I used an old Sony analog recorder and would just plop it down between the subjects and me and ask them about their lives and experiences. And as I prepared for this presentation, I was constantly wondering how these early leaders would confront the challenges that we have today. And many of them, a good portion of the people that you'll hear from today, have since died. So if you look at our current state in emergency medicine, these are some of the issues. It's enough to make you scream. These issues they're pretty universal, pretty ubiquitous across the U.S., but with different levels of pain depending on where you practice, whether it's ED boarding or mental health boarding or what the pain point is. But I'll take a look at each of these areas with a historical eye to see if those who came before us can enlighten us. Please come in and sit down. Feel free. Yeah, you won't interrupt me. Thanks. So if I look back at our history and imply that maybe things aren't so bad now, I might be engaging in a behavior that I didn't even know existed a year ago, and that's called toxic positivity. The premise of this is that if we spin things too positively when there's despair, that we risk further injuring those who are affected by negative conditions. So I guess I can buy that, and I'll try to avoid it, but throwing that toxic positive flag also seems to me to be a way for pessimists and people who are glass half empty to justify their negativity. So I will tread cautiously, and I'm inherently an optimist, and a lot of that comes from what our forebears in emergency medicine taught me. This statement, the chief reason for the ever-expanding use of the emergency ward, is simply that it is the best possible place in which to solve a medical problem quickly and accurately. The public knows it, and so does the doctor. This was from a Massachusetts general internist, and we're all not in agreement. This statement is pretty accurate, but it was written in 1966. It was published in Atlantic Monthly. We've been solving problems for patients and our healthcare system, or lack of a healthcare system, for a long, long time by being the safety net for U.S. medicine. And a big part of the problem is that we're so damn good at what we do. If you look back in 1966, when Knowles made that statement, we were seeing about 30 million patients a year. That more than doubled in the next decade. By 1975, it was up to 73 million. And as shown here, we hit 100 million by the year 2000, and although the rate of growth has slowed, there's what seems to be this endless demand for emergency care. During this time, the number of hospitals has shrunk, so especially in smaller communities, we're seeing hospital closures So the remaining emergency departments are absorbing those patients. But there hasn't been, as we know, a proportionate increase in emergency department resources for us to care for these patients, and that leaves us where we are today with high volumes of increasingly sicker patients, widespread boarding of admitted patients, and inadequate care options for patients who have mental health issues. But this is not just a modern problem. Let's look back to Dr. Gail Anderson, who in 1971 became the first chair of an academic department of emergency medicine at LA County, USC. He'd been an accomplished gynecologic surgeon. He pioneered some techniques for pelvic infections, and somehow he was asked to take over the emergency department there, which was a mess, and run the newly approved emergency medicine residency that came in 1973. So how many patients were they seeing per day at Big County then? Let's hear what he had to say.
We were seeing 1,000 patients a day at that time in this department.
1,000 patients a day. Think you got it bad? It's a pretty busy place. Boarding of admitted patients was obviously as bad then as it was now. But Anderson and his team, they somehow managed through this, and he told me how he admired the residents who were working in this very challenging environment, and you can hear the positivity in his voice when he talks about that.
The moments of despair and angst were there, but the momentum, the total momentum, and the residents were an inspiration to me. I thought, my God, these guys are willing to risk their whole future in this, and they're bright people. There's something here.
So the EDs at this time, you have to understand, at most academic centers in the 1970s, totally resident run with almost no faculty supervision. In a clip I'll play for you, Dr. Judy Tintinelli, who became obviously a great leader in academic emergency medicine, she started out as an internal medicine resident at the University of Michigan, did her training there before going into emergency medicine. And she describes what it was like to work as a resident in the emergency department at the University of Michigan Hospital at that time, where the ED was on the 3rd floor of the hospital.
We used to work 24 on, 24 off. I was in the ER on the 3rd floor, and there was one medical person and one surgical person. And so what we did was just share stuff so that, somebody could sleep.
So in Ann Arbor at that time, you better hope you didn't get sick.
We used to work.
So Dr. Pamela Benson was the first woman emergency medicine resident at Medical College of Pennsylvania, started in 1971. She became interested in emergency medicine as a medical student, and in a story that's described in my book, she worked with David Wagner, who was originally a pediatric surgeon. And remember, everyone at that time migrated into emergency medicine, and he was put in charge of the emergency department there, and she was charged with going to the AMA and pleading the case to start the residency, which was eventually approved, and she started in 1971. She talks about what it was like to experience the ED, again, run by interns, still divided into different medical care areas when she started in her intern year.
Well, you have to realize that there was nobody on in the emergency department. The emergency department was run by the upper class residents. Our emergency department was divided into 3 sections: medicine, surgery, and OB. And that's where we got into trouble as far as the patient went, because if you got a patient that they got triaged, and triage meaning what bed they got put in, not how evaluated they were, and they got into the OB section, it wasn't until the OB residents finally got down there to see what the interns were doing to say, well, I don't think this is OB, I think this is an appendix. You'd play round robin on somebody that really needed to come in the hospital, back then at least.
So Cincinnati General Hospital had established the first ever emergency medicine residency in 1970 when the hospital administrator, Joseph Linder, and a junior internal medicine physician named Herbert Flessa, who was put in charge of running all the ambulatory services and the emergency department 1 year out of his hematology-oncology fellowship. And then a Ohio-born UC medical student named Bruce Janiak. They all came together to see if this would fly. Janiak was the solo one person in his class resident in 1970 and 71, no classmates. So he was the first and only emergency medicine resident in the world at that time. The residents saw little of the emergency department in their rotation. It was a 2-year residency after the internship. They spent only 2 months in the emergency department in their PGY 2-year, no months in the emergency department in their PGY 3-year, because there was no one to teach them in the emergency department other than other residents. So they tried to get their learning on other services. But Janiak was like the king of the emergency department. He had his own office there, a separate office with his name on it. And he had a refrigerator there stocked with beer. And he would invite consulting residents to come down, and after they did the consult, they would go have a beer together. Do any of you do that now? I know but he had no supervision. Flessa was technically in charge of the emergency department, but he basically never came to the emergency department. And Janiak talked about that when I interviewed him. You'll hear him say in this clip, her, and he's referring to the student health physician, and he says this is the one encounter he had with an attending physician in the ED in all his time in residency.
And I was in the department one day, examining a patient on the stretcher, when she walked by, put her hands on this patient's abdomen and said to me, aha, the classic doughy abdomen of abdominal tuberculosis, and walked away. That was my one interaction in 2 years. And I still to this day say, what the hell is a classic doughy abdomen of abdominal tuberculosis?
So I don't know if any of you made that diagnosis, but so Cincinnati in the early years was not a very high-quality training experience. Philip Butteravoli, who was in the second class in Cincinnati, told me that a program director was appointed in his second year, someone who had only done an internal medicine internship but was felt to be qualified to run the residency. But in the meetings with the residents, this program director would try to talk them out of going into emergency medicine, saying, this is not going to be a specialty, you should just do internal medicine. So Richard Levy, who came in a few years later, still found the residency training pretty dismal, and he relates in this clip what it was like for him.
But I can tell you that it was wild and woolly. It was the Old West compared to anything that anybody could imagine today. It was unsupervised. It was not good. It offended me. I didn't like it because I was always worried about hurting people, and I knew that other people were making mistakes that could be harmful, and I knew that was happening, but there wasn't any supervision. And I also knew that it was for another generation that was out there to bring some order to all of this and to be able to make it work with some instruction.
Yeah, it always strikes me that he said it offended me. I hope none of you are offended by your training, but I just thought that was an interesting choice of words. So our emergency medicine residents today work in very challenging environments. They have to master knowledge and skills that the early residents couldn't even imagine. But they have 24-hour supervision of attendings who don't argue with them about whether there should be a specialty of emergency medicine. So. In New York City, Dr. Louis Goldfrank, who's a fascinating person, he was raised by activist parents who were accused of being communists in the McCarthy era. He was then kicked out of Johns Hopkins Medical School for supporting black classmates who faced discrimination, and he also attended civil rights marches, and that wasn't compatible with the values at Hopkins at that point. So he finished medical school in Europe, and after residency in Connecticut, he came back to New York City to battle the issues that plagued healthcare there. He initially worked at Morrisania Hospital, where he describes the conditions that he found there. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm sorry that clip isn't showing, so I will fix that. So he then moved in 1979 to the oldest hospital in New York City, Bellevue, where the conditions were just as bad, and he fought a powerful chair of internal medicine there named Saul Farber, who eventually, unfortunately, became the dean and was even more powerful force against him. He opposed everything that Goldfrank tried to do in advancing emergency medicine care and education to get a residency started. But Goldfrank, more than anyone else, anywhere else in the country, took the fight beyond the hospital and into the media. He was a popular person to be interviewed. He basically called out the very poor level of emergency care, and it worked, and he was able to advance the program, get the residency started, hire faculty, develop an academic program. But he showed others how the use of the media could be very important in getting what you need to get done. Peter Rosen is an iconic figure in emergency medicine. After training in surgery and then the military service in Germany, he settled his family in Wyoming, and he was a community surgeon, often driving a couple hundred miles a day to different hospitals as part of his practice. He helped establish the first ICUs in Wyoming hospitals, and he was admitted to one when he had his first MI at the age of 34, and another one just a few months later. So he decided to change his life. He moved back to Chicago, where he had done medical school, and he was given a position in the Department of Surgery with the job of running a very dysfunctional emergency department. He had almost no support, even from his own department, as we'll hear here.
Neither was the University of Chicago, and that was the minor reason. In 6 years there, I simply had nothing but total hostility every day of the year. I had more friends in the non-medical faculty than I was able to make in the medical faculty in 6 years. We had no admitting privileges. We had fights every single day. I mean, to the point where one of the surgical faculty tried to physically attack one of my residents who was simply trying to resuscitate a patient, to the point where the chief of surgery told me that if I didn't fire that resident, he was going to testify against us in a lawsuit. And I sat him down with the chief of staff and said, hey, we're supposed to be on the same side here. If you don't like the way we practice, educate us. But you can't make enemies out of us, and you're the one who starts it. And then I started assigning faculty to all of the various departmental M&Ms, because if you were there, you could defend the emergency department. But it was, I mean, you talk about hostile environments. The university had unanimously agreed to develop emergency medicine, and then unanimously did everything possible to kill it.
But they didn't kill it. He kept going there for 6 years. He established a residency. He was a tremendous recruiter, and a number of the people that he trained there went out to start other programs and were leaders in emergency medicine. Then Rosen moved after 6 years to Denver General Hospital, where he built another very successful residency and academic program and populated the specialty with leaders, some of whom might even be here today. So resident life in the old days then, it was routine to have 24-hour shifts in the emergency department, and more commonly on off-service rotations, where they were given the least desirable shifts and long shifts. There was exploitation and insults from physicians and other specialties. 24-hour emergency medicine faculty supervision wasn't mandated by the RRC and ACGME until 1989. And work hours restrictions, as you know, didn't come in really until 2011. So, you know, I would say that the working conditions for residents have certainly much better today. I think our residents are admired and respected for their broad-based clinical knowledge and skills. But, you know, 30, 35 years ago, we were in some cases reviled, we were harassed, put down. Judy Tintinelli talks about asking a professor from internal medicine to do a talk on pancreatic disease for their residency, just for their residency conference. And this is the response she got.
To give a talk on pancreatitis or something like that, and he was so nasty. He's like, I hate emergency. I mean, I call this man on the phone. He's a full professor, right? He's like, I hate emergency medicine. You guys have no business being there. I'm not going to help teach you anything.
So, not a very collegial situation. And, you know, we may continue to see some of this today, but the magnitude of it is tiny compared to what many of us experienced during our training.
To give a talk on
Sorry. In the summer of 2002, I traveled to Jackson, Wyoming, where Peter Rosen was living, and his good friend Robert Daly was visiting, and we went on a fly fishing trip down the Snake River. So Daly was an early convert to emergency medicine practice after training in internal medicine. He was appointed the residency director at LA County USC by Gail Anderson, and then he moved on to become the ED director, kind of the department chair, and started an emergency medicine residency at Valley Medical Center in Fresno, California. He had a very hostile welcome there from the time he was unloading his car into the apartment he was going to move into, from a resident who came up to him and started yelling at him because the residents from other services were getting moonlighting pay for helping to staff the emergency department, and he was going to start a residency, so it was going to cut a lot of the incentive pay that these residents were getting. So he he had a lot of challenges right from the start. And I'm going to play a clip from him. At the end of the clip, he provided one of my favorite quotes on how emergency medicine was viewed in the 1970s. And we did this interview outside, and you'll hear the wind coming down into my little analog recorder from the Teton Mountains.
You can ask the next question, which is, well, when did the fun start? And of course the fun started almost immediately, because there were a lot of people involved in emergency medicine who were nationally involved and who were starting residencies under the worst of circumstances, as Peter has undoubtedly eloquently outlined. It was an awful process to do. I mean, starting a residency program was akin to lifting yourself up by your bootstraps. I mean, the idea of faculty was ludicrous, yet you had to have faculty. The idea of receiving institutional, monetary, and academic support was ludicrous. The idea of the emergency department as anything other than that dreadful place down on the first floor that you always had letters of complaint from and other problems with soups, et cetera, and bitching from the house staff about being there. It was nothing but a problem. It was a wart on the ass of prosperity, no question about it.
One of my favorite quotes ever, a wart on the ass of prosperity. But, despite all this, the early emergency medicine residencies struggled along. Almost all of them survived. The residents this time often spoke about how tight their groups became, as expressed here by Philip Butteravoli. This photo is actually not of him, it's from another resident there. But he talks about these soldiers of fortune and this band of brothers mentality sustained these pioneering people. It did take a while for there to be many sisters in this band of brothers, but that's what I will go into next, is women in academic emergency medicine. So, like most of medicine in the 1970s and 80s, emergency medicine was a very male-dominated field. And for the few women pioneers who chose emergency medicine, it was a very challenging path. Whether it was Pam Benson, who was the first woman resident, or Dr. Judy Tintinelli, the first woman chair of emergency medicine and also the first woman president of ABEM, or Dr. Nancy Auer, who came out of neurosurgery to come into emergency medicine. She was the first woman president of ACEP. But their stories are similar. There was this questioning as to why they'd chosen this path, a lack of recognition of what women could add, and difficulty in getting elected or selected to these higher positions. Pam Benson describes what a chore it was for her to get elected to the ACEP board. It took her years and years, but she finally got elected. And when that happened, she remembers going to the photo shoot for the board and jokingly holding up neckties over her dress to say, which one should I choose to wear? But more seriously, she described telling the male board members that significant discussion about board topics would have to end when people went into the restroom during the breaks, because all the men went into the men's room and they were still talking about key issues, and she was going into the women's room. So has it changed for the better? I think yes, we have a significant number of women chairs in emergency medicine, although it's still about 11%. We have had women leaders in ABEM, and throughout medicine, we have deans who are women from emergency medicine. But given that women achieved parity in medical school enrollment in 2008, we would hope that our women EM residents would get to be equal to men by now. But that percent is plateaued, or maybe around 35, 37%, maybe be dropping a little bit. Nationally, we think there's about 27, 29% of emergency physicians are women. And so while blatant sexism and gender discrimination, maybe it's not as bad as it was 30 or 40 years ago, but women in our field still encounter bias and mistreatment, and we don't have gender equity in salaries, as has been demonstrated in recent publications. So we have a ways to go. When I interviewed the early women leaders in emergency medicine, I was struck by how tolerant they were to the inequities and slights. They had such a strength of character and a positive outlook on things, even when they were the only woman in the group. I asked Dr. Tintinelli if she ever found it lonely, and here is her response, which I think will make you smile.
You didn't feel professionally lonely when you were at, meetings, organizational to me, and there would be, a couple women?
Never, never, never. We just had a lot of fun.
Yeah.
I remember.
Yeah, you weren't excluded from your.
Oh my God, I remember Dave Wagner is a good dancer. We used to dance a lot, we had a lot of fun.
Yeah,
I could drink better than most of us.
Now, I'm not advocating that for women to get ahead in emergency medicine to outdrink the men, but yeah, and David Wagner was this wonderful man, raised a Quaker, and the idea of him dancing with Judy Tentnow, who's here on the bottom right in her dress, and dancing at some ABEM meeting just really gives me a smile. And so it is important to note times of success. 2008 was a good year for representation of women in leadership positions in major organizations in emergency medicine. So the photo wasn't very clear, but we had Kate Halpern, SAEM president, Linda Lawrence, ACEP president, Judy Tentnow, AACEM, the academic chairs president, Rita Sedelka, ABEM president, Mary Jo Wagner, CORD president, and Sandy Snyder, the RRC chair during that year. And there was a great article published about the 6 of them and has a lot of great comments in it. Well, time passes and things change, but one thing that I wish is that men's multicolor striped plaid slacks would come back in style, modeled here by Dr. Robert Wolfensberger, who was the first president of EMRA in 1974. So I actually had a pair like this, and I'm hoping that I'll be able to, it'll go back in style. I'll buy another pair in my lifetime. So. One thing that's on everyone's minds and being actively discussed at this meeting in many venues is the marked drop-off in emergency medicine residency match competitiveness. U.S. senior medical students seem to be running away from emergency medicine in a way that we have never actually seen. And full exploration of this topic is kind of beyond the scope of my talk here today. But it's not inaccurate to say that the EM residency match has never been as bad as it was this March. If you look, EM in the NRMP started in 1982. We had this rise in popularity of the specialty in the 80s, and fill rates, which were were higher in the early 1980s, came to be, we had great fill rates. And then we had this rapid rise in programs that obviously has created a lot of concern, almost doubling in the decade between 2012 and 2023. And so 46% of our programs unfilled, are unmatched, didn't fully match, and 554 unfilled positions where 3 or 4 years ago we had, less than 30 or 40, right? So we'll have to see how many of these unfilled positions end up being filled by international grads or DOs who may end up being very qualified emergency physicians. But this outcome was based on trends and this rapid increase in approved residency programs that a lot of us saw coming, and it was probably preventable. So whether or not we experience a sustained downturn as was seen in anesthesiology in the 1990s and the early 2000s, that remains to be determined. But this is a substantial new challenge for our specialty. And in this one, I have to say, it's never been this bad. And if you look at the academic emergency medicine job market, I think it's another case where it has never been as tight as it has been in the last couple years. The early emergency medicine residency grads could often go directly into ED director roles. You could go from being a senior resident to running an ED in 2 days. And people who wanted to go into academic emergency medicine could often come right out of residency. As you know now, much harder. Often a fellowship is something that's expected. And those expectations and qualifications have changed over time. Unless you think back to where if you wanted to go into academics, there weren't many choices. When I graduated residency, wanted to do academics, I wanted to be in the Northeast, but there were literally like 3 or 4 programs that had credible academic departments that I could go into at the time. So it's a different type of limitation now, but I think that we are looking at a time when it is harder to get academic jobs, but not impossible. And I think it's going to open up a little bit in the coming years. We may think that corporate emergency medicine and for-profit mega groups are a phenomenon of the new millennium, but the issues existed since the birth of the field. Dr. Carl Mangold was the first person to form a corporation with his colleague, Dr. Fisher, to run multiple emergency departments in the Bay Area of San Francisco. in the late 1960s and early 1970s. He was probably the first person to be called a robber baron of emergency medicine. But when I interviewed him, I found him to be much different than I expected. From his start, he started out moonlighting as a resident in local emergency departments in San Francisco before there were any emergency physicians. He was just another person covering the emergency department, and he had this idea that like we could put together multi-hospital groups. He was always a strong supporter of emergency medicine education, especially resident education and training. He became eventually the president of ACEP, and through that process, he became a board member of the American Board of Emergency Medicine when it was approved in 1979. And the emergency physicians who worked for him often stayed in his group for decades, and he did hire residency-trained physicians. It is true that he sometimes hired poorly qualified physicians to staff his smaller and more rural emergency departments. But this is a man who was, as you can read in the quote here, a true blue capitalist, but he actually helped the field advance at a crucial time. He showed people how you could actually make money in emergency medicine with a well-organized multi-hospital group. Again, he did it in a for-profit manner. So now in 2023, we're very much concerned about, I think, a different type of corporatization of emergency medicine in many parts of the country. And this is indeed a threat to the job security and compensation of emergency physicians, but this goes way, way back. So U.S. physicians in all major surveys are reporting levels of burnout and dissatisfaction that have never been recorded before. Emergency physicians are almost always, unfortunately, in the higher end of burnout scales. So what can we learn from our history in this area? I think it's clear that a sense of purpose, a high level of meaning, feeling part of something bigger than yourself can be protective from burnout, and maybe that explains why these early emergency physician leaders, despite the significant challenges they faced, they had no board, they had constant criticism from other specialties, they were energized, they were optimistic. And sure, they had their down moments, which they would relate to me when I interviewed them, but they lifted each other up with this vision of what this specialty could become. Richard Levy described, who was the chair of emergency medicine in Cincinnati for many years, described what it was like even with his own parents trying to explain to them what emergency medicine was.
There was always the undercurrent of, what's a smart guy like you doing in this? Why are you doing this? What's wrong with you? And in a similar fashion, I think my father asked the question of, how does this fit into the house of medicine? My mother, I thought, asked a more insightful question is, why would you want to do this? Which was actually a much tougher question to answer. What I'm saying is that people outside also couldn't understand why, a bright, energetic, smiling human being would go into something called the emergency room, because it had a terrible reputation. I mean, it's sort of like, that's where losers are. Right? It was almost like a general concept of losers hang out there. So no, it was always a matter of, and that was part of what shaped me. I mean, if you think of my personality as you knew it, part of what shaped me, maybe even put a little bit of a chip on my shoulder.
And then pictured here, there was John Wittgenstein, this quiet, reserved, but very powerful man. He was born in a log cabin in Missouri. He didn't have a birth certificate. He wandered through many jobs before he went to medical school at Michigan. He then went on to found ACEP, founding member. He became its first president, despite being absolutely terrified of public speaking. He would vomit numerous times before he would go to give even the simplest speech in front of people. And when I interviewed him, he was so modest and shy that I had 2 hours of recording on him, and I couldn't get one good audible quote out of that 2 hours. But he did tell me this story about how he scrambled to get the signatures of the presidents of the other U.S. medical boards so that ABEM could be voted on by the American Board of Medical Specialties in 1979. And so I will read that page from my book, since I don't have the audio. So he says, I was trying my best to get everybody's signature in time to make it official. Our strategy was to get it done over the Christmas holidays when I could make a trip around to their homes to get their signatures. I made the trip in 48 hours. John Benson was in Oregon. I met him at the airport. John Davis was in Vermont. The guy who was president of ABMS was visiting his grandmother in Canada, so I went to Canada. I got home totally exhausted. I had cut my finger and drawn blood in it 120 days before, inserting an endotracheal tube down a jaundice patient. I washed the cut off and put a Band-Aid on it. He was dying, so I didn't put my gloves on or anything. Anyway, I didn't think much of it at the time, but after that exhausting trip, I became very ill. It was during the 78th snowstorm in Michigan, which some of us might remember. We were snowed in. My wife asked me to go get some milk and stuff, but I couldn't get the car out, so I walked to the store. I was coming back and collapsed in the snow. All my energy was gone. I lay there for 10 or 15 minutes, but I decided I didn't want to die in the snow, so I made my way home. I looked in the mirror and saw my yellow sclera, noticed my urine was dark. I was out of work for about 3 months, so he had viral hepatitis B. He then, a few months later, though, was very much in the mix as they were able to get the board approved, as shown here in this photo. So September 1979, the original ABEM certification approved. George Podgorny, another really interesting character who was serving as both the president of ASAP and ABEM at the same time, he is coming to this meeting in Atlanta, congratulating all of them. So you see from the left, Wittgenstein, Ron Chrome, David Wagner, Carl Mangold, R. Squared Hannes, this tremendous blend of leaders. And there was a medallion that you can see here that was created, and the words on it are, "The art of progress is to preserve order amid change and to preserve change amid mid-order." So I think we can debate on whether that adage applies today, but we clearly need to shake up the current order and embrace change if we're going to get to where we want to go. And as we think about our challenges and things that might not be going so well right now, let's also realize that emergency medicine is on a positive trajectory with a lot to celebrate. So if you look through things here, we have high-quality training programs at the best academic medical center. We're a major contributor to undergraduate medical education, to our many leaders in medical student education in our field. Research in emergency medicine, our forebears in emergency medicine would never have imagined the impact or the breadth of the research in our scientists in emergency medicine, how they've fully integrated into research in other fields, how they've done things around the world. And our organizations like SAEM are strong and growing. And all across the country, emergency physicians are tapped to lead health systems, medical schools. They're CMOs. They're running health system. There's deans of medical schools. They're very high up in governmental organizations. They're in Congress. In 2015-16, we had Steve Stack, who became the first emergency medicine president of the AMA and the youngest president at that time, 2015-16. So if we step back, we can appreciate that we are still positively powerful in emergency medicine despite some of our issues now. This slide just shows how our academic organization, SAEM, has increased in membership, and it's been a really strong place. I don't think it's ever been stronger. And I think the future is still bright. I personally feel that things are going in the right direction, and my succession plan is right here. My wife and I produced our wonderful daughter, Corey, who chose the field of emergency medicine with absolutely no pressure from her father. And she's now an emergency physician working in the North Shore system in Chicago. And she has a daughter and a son on the way, and of course, I will not pressure them to go into emergency medicine either. But if they do, I'll be delighted because I think it's still the truest calling in medicine. I've saved a couple of the giants of emergency medicine for last. Ron Chrome started the academic department and residency at Detroit Receiving Hospital, now Wayne State, in the 1970s, and then he moved on to William Beaumont Hospital and did it all over again. And he was an absolute powerhouse in those days. He's someone who united the academic side of the field with the practice side. He held all these titles, president of ABEM, ASAP, UAEM, inaugural editor of Annals of Emergency Medicine. He was everywhere. And when I interviewed him at his home in Naples, Florida in 2002, we had to do it in his screened-in porch in the patio area because Ron was such a big cigarette smoker and his wife had banned smoking in the house. And he had this gravelly voice, if you remember him, and he was this lovable curmudgeon, but wow, was he passionate about emergency medicine and so proud of what he and others had accomplished. So as I'm interviewing him and he blew smoke in my face and he lit one cigarette literally off the butt of the one that was burning down. And he waved his arms and he gave me my favorite quote of all my interviews. And the context of this is that a surgeon that he knew and was friends with asked Ron what he thought he would be remembered for, and this is what he said.
When he said to me, Ron, what did you do with your career? I said, I'm one of the people that helped change the face of American medicine. And there are very few people, Brian, that can say that. And I'm not a researcher. I will never come out with a soft vaccine. But that's the class, maybe it's egotistical of me to see it, but John Wittgenstein, Ron Krohn, and a few others, George Pagorny, Peter Rosen, A.N.S. Harris Graves, the people with early commitments that fought for this, we changed the face of fucking medicine. American medicine.
That's just the emergency medicine way of saying it, isn't it? So emergency medicine was born out of this pressing need in this country for someone to step up and provide better care, acute care, for the millions of people who are presenting to emergency departments looking for help. And it's always been about the patients for us, and we need to remember that. John Marks was another giant in emergency medicine. He trained in Denver under Peter Rosen. He became the chair of emergency medicine at Carolinas, where he built a fabulous residency and great academic programs. He was the president of SAEM. He died unexpectedly in 2012, and our highest SAEM award is named for him, which Andy Jagoda got today, deservingly. When I interviewed John, he had what I think is this wonderful perspective on emergency medicine and the patients, so I'll close with his remarks and remember him fondly as a friend and a role model.
Am I glad I went into medicine? Absolutely. My favorite thing is to take care of people. And I don't mean to take care of cases. I mean to be with the people. And I've loved that more as I've gotten older because of being a father, being other experiences in my life. I don't know what. Being closer to death myself. And understanding maybe better what it's like to live out in the street, what it's like for a lot of people who don't have some of our resources. And all those little vignettes that you experience in emergency medicine, you never, ever would have anywhere else. Incredible privilege and opportunity. So yes, medicine, absolutely emergency medicine.
So I have a hard time listening to that without getting choked up. But as I close, I'm going to leave it to you to decide if it's ever been this bad in emergency medicine. And I hope that this walk, through our history and the voices of those who came before us will inspire you. Even if you think things are bad, I hope it will inspire you to work with as much passion and purpose as they did, for the benefit of our patients and our specialty and our communities. So I thank you for your attention. We have a few minutes. If anyone wants to share anything or has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you. Comments, questions? Okay. Yes, please. I did write a book about this, yes. The name of the book is Anyone, Anything, Anytime, A History of Emergency Medicine. Yeah. Questions, comments? All right, thank you very much. Have a great meeting.